Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good to see everybody here today. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome Sherry, who's always here, and Jessica Yates, Sue Swibb, Lance Walden. We have another wonderful show, wonderful podcast in store for everybody today. And just to let you know, Jessica is not going to be able to make it today. Not because she's under the weather or anything like that, but she has a lot going on with getting everything ready. The final touches for Sukkot in Davenport and the final touches for Luttersworth at the museum. She's got to get all those banners and everything ready. So with that said, Jessica wanted me to make a couple of announcements to let you guys know that there is still one room available for Sukkot. We had a cancellation. So Sukkot is here in Davenport, Florida, once again, the 5th through the 15th. And anybody going, everybody that's already registered to go, Jessica needs you to contact her with your IDs. And if you're bringing a car through, also your license plate information, because there's an actual guard shack at the gate. And you'll need all that information so you can get in and out, because it's a very secure location, which is a great time. And also, anybody in the UK and the surrounding area, the museum, the Luttersworth Museum for Sefer Scripture exhibits will begin on November 15th. And that's what Jessica is getting ready for. So if anybody's in that area, she'd love for you to show up. Anybody in the rugby area, they're going to have a wonderful band that's playing there, and they're going to have different selections that they're doing, music and all that. So it's going to be a great event. If you can make it out there, it would be much appreciated. So tonight, once again, we have our resident expert, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, and Gary Wayne, and we're going to be going through Genesis 6, Nimrod with Genesis 6 with the mighty men, Genesis 10 through 8, where it talks about the mighty men in Nimrod and how he became a mighty man. So Gary's going to take us through all that information, and of course, we'll be going back and forth. Doc will be adding to it, and Gary will take us where he wants to go. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Gary on. Welcome, Gary. Good to see you here again.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. So happy to be with you guys and looking forward to the discussion today and to tie, I think, a very important part of prehistory after the flood into how the world works today. So I think it's going to be a good show.
Absolutely. Welcome, Stephen. Good to see you here again, brother.
I'm just glad to be here, Stacy and Gary. Just glad to be here. And, it's a good thing at my age to wake up and be able to be here.
Amen. Amen.
So that's worth anything, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Gary, you just take off and take us where you want to go. Introduce, wherever you're going to start and all the information to your book. It's all you.
Yeah, so we're going to cover 4 chapters here, and it's basically one narrative, but I wanted to do it into separate chapters to sort of explain some of the nuances of each sort of portion of the story. So it's Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and sort of what rolls away from that. So in the book is chapter 27, 28, 29, and 30. And so Nimrod is one of those fabulous sort of characters that has its own mythos that's grown up around Nimrod as he's absorbed not only from a monotheist perspective and what our speculations might be on top of that, but also he crosses over into the testimonies or the histories, or at least how they draft him in as part of their history as well, and their accountings for them. So this is a very important individual shortly after the flood, which most people might be familiar with, that he is the one who is king of Babel and Babel City and Babel Tower. It's not sort of explicitly stated as that, except that he's the king of Babylon, so and the king of Babel. So, but in the Babel narrative, it's kind of short and not a lot of detail, but all the information that's in there provides a lot of detail, just as the very little detail with Nimrod in Genesis 10. And in Genesis 10, we don't receive any descendants of Cush. which is kind of interesting in itself. Like, why not? Because it's the table of nations, and we're getting the offspring of the original three sons and then their sons, right? So we don't get that sort of extended detail. Nimrod shows up as the son of Cush, but he, without explanation, doesn't have anyone else, but yet he is so very, very influential based on the cities that we're told that Nimrod builds and builds after Babel as well. And so in the Bible, in the Masoretic translations, we have Nimrod being a mighty one, and he becomes a mighty one, which is again very, very sort of interesting language. In the Sumerian tradition, there's a parallel king that's named Enmerakar, who I'll probably talk a little bit about as we go through here. And what's interesting about Nimrod's name is that he is that word is a foreign word from Hebrew, so he's probably been renamed and another name adopted because it's a foreign word, and it's designed, as we understand Nimrod, it basically sort of means to rebel out of the Hebrew and to be brave, and associated with things that tyrants do. And in the ancient Sumerian, and there's similar transliterations within the Akkadian versions and other Mesopotamian versions, but Enmerakar is third generation after the flood. So is Nimrod. And Enmerakar builds a ziggurat at Eridu in Shinar, where Nimrod is building Babel and remains in Shinar or Sumer. And so this seems to be, as you sort of look at the details, and it's building a tower, and the languages are going to be confused, and people are going to be dispersed. And I'll come back to probably this a little bit in the show as well with some of the other accounts. But that name Enmerakar almost holds the original sort of Semitic or Hebrew of NMR for Nimrod. You might have a D in there as well, or a T, but NMR as Nimaru would be one of the other sort of variant spellings that sort of comes out. What's interesting about the name of Enmerakar is N as in Anki, Nen meaning Lord, and Ki meaning earth in Sumerian, Lord of the earth, an offspring god of Anu who rules after the flood. Is that word would be as the prefix as a lord or a king, depending on how you're understanding the title that's going to. And then you have Kar as the word for a hunter in Sumerian. And you also have Kar can also be understood as a mountain as well, or a horn. And so we have on, and then we have MERA, which is kind of encapsulates NMR as part of the Nimrod name. And so we have basically, he is the Lord Hunter, and it means hunter as well for Kar. And just as Nimrod is a mighty one and a mighty hunter, right? Before the god. So you have these correlations there. So you could get a translation there that, Enmerakar is the Lord Hunter of the mountain, which, of course, the people of the plain, they come down and marching on the mountains. So you have this very similar story, which seems to be perhaps a source for the name Nimrod, as you take that back to the vowelless original Sumerian and the vowelless Hebrew and the vowelless Semitic. And so he's also understood as a giant in the Septuagint. And in fact, he's a mighty giant. And so they take the word Gabor from Hebrew, and they translate that, I think, in their cultural lens, but Some people would say, no, they're taking the giant aspect of it, but it's probably a combination of that. And Gibor means a mighty one, a brave one, a hero, right? And heroes in Greek mythology were giants, just as Hercules is the offspring of Zeus and Alcmene, a hero and a giant, part of the rulers of the Gyges king. Gyges is the Greek word for giant, and that's how they translate that into the Septuagint. So, and mighty one, Gibor, is used to describe a giant.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Septuagint calls him the giant hunter. And again, it's sort of, you see how they got there, whether or not he's actually a giant or not is kind of the interesting sort of aspect to who Nimrod was. And biblically, he became a mighty one. Kal-El, as we understand that in the Hebrew, and something changes, something happens, and we know he's the son of Cush, but something changes, and he's going to act like a tyrant, just as Nephilim is in part defined as a tyrant or a bully or a tribe of giants or a giant in particular. So you see all of these sort of interesting sort of connections that Nimrod has. And the question is he actually a giant, or is he something changed to make him like a giant? And how does he become so wedded with giants? And so we have, I think, a combination of merging of these sort of thoughts that will happen, a couple, say 150 to 200 years ago, and then with the translations of Sayce and Smith. Smith in particular, but Sayce is also doing translations of the similar ones and writing in the same field and using and translate and working with Smith on some of these translations, it seems. And so he looks at Idzubar as Nimrod, that they're from Uruk, just as Nimrod would be king of Uruk. And part of his empire in Sumeria. And Idzubar, people aren't familiar with that. That's the legends of Idzubar. And it tells the same identical story as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Exactly the same. And so Gilgamesh now is the one that we would understand as being connected with Nimrod. And in fact, if you Google images, you get the same image for Gilgamesh as Nimrod. And a lot of people think that Nimrod is Gilgamesh. And they've almost been kind of conflated, but it adds to sort of that giant sort of mythos. The thing is with Gilgamesh is he's about 6th generation after the flood. In terms of the giant named Gilgamesh ruling in Uruk after the flood versus the Gilgamesh that would be in the Book of Giants, one of the Enochian accounts with naming of giant. But it's not unusual to have a giant after the flood named after a giant before the flood. It's actually quite common, like Magog, for example, or Gog. And Gog and Magog are part of the Gyges giant kings of the Herculides bloodline of Zeus. So as you see this sort of coming through, we get this mythos that comes around, and we don't specifically have language for Nimrod as a giant. But you could get there through the word mighty one, because in the book of Job, you actually have Gibor being translated one time as specifically giant. And if you wanted to get a little bit secular, you could go to the Ugaritic text, which is adopted by the seculars, but it's highly religious because it's the Canaanite pantheon, the Rephaim pantheon of gods, and the writings of Ugarit city, the city of Ug. And that GBR in the original Semitic, which is so very close to the original vowelless Hebrew, it's almost identical in many cases, and the words come over very easily, like NPL for Nephilim or RPM for Rephaim. And GBR is the original Semitic for Gibor. And so GBR shows up in the Ugaritic text in two ways: as mighty ones, describing the giants, and also a specific tribe of Gibor, although we don't specifically get a specific tribe of Gibberine listed in the Bible, the Ugaritic text, which people don't know where the Ugarit is. It's between Mount Hermon and Tyr in the north country of the Covenant Land. So it's in that Covenant Land region. And all of a sudden now you have a tribe of giants that's actually named GBR or Gabor.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we get this connection to giants. And so I make the case and I don't really care whether or not Nimrod's a giant or not, but I can't really sort of get there through the standard Masoretic text as a giant. I'm open to it. I just don't have that smoking gun verse like, where's the giant here? Unless we're going to say Cush is the giant, but the mother could have been a female giant. However you want to get there, I'm open to that possibility, but I don't have it. All I have is something changed with with Nimrod to emulate the giants. And he seemed to make his reputation amongst the giants, which we'll get into before. But I just wanted to sort of lay that down. And even the Gnostic secret society versions of Nimrod suggest he's a mighty warrior, suggest he's a tyrant king, but not a giant. Large, but not a giant. Strong, but not a giant. Something sort of distinct. So I'm not here to change anybody's mind in terms of who Nimrod is, but when you have so many multiple accounts from different cultures and religions describing an individual, what we need to take from it, he was the most influential individual in the early post-Diluvian epoch. And somehow he gets control over all of the people. And so then again, there's various accounts of that. We're not shown how that happened sort of biblically. But it's safe to say he's the king of Babel. So I'm just going to let you guys back in. I just wanted to set that down, and I seem to have a phone ringing in the background.
Okay, go ahead, Doc.
Well, it's interesting because looking at the name Nimrod in the Hebrew, right? So we have this idea of Nun, Mem, Resh, Vav, Dalet, and of course, in rightly dividing the word, I like to kind of peel off and see, are there prefixes that could lead to an underlying root? And there are two prefixes here. Both Nun and Mem are prefixes. Mem typically means from, and Nun typically means we will be. So for instance, to give you an example, Aleph means I will be as a prefix. Nun means we will be as a prefix. And then, of course, you have Tav, which means you shall. You shall. And so these three different prefixes are going to give us a little bit of a clue. So oftentimes you will see, for instance, the suffix nu, which is nun vav, and nun vav, which is what? We will be the nail, right? We will be the nail is what nun vav means, but it's often construed as our or us as a suffix. When we look at Nimrod, we can see the nun meaning we will be, the mem from, but what is the word root? Resh Vav Dalet. Well, Resh Vav Dalet is a Hebrew word. It is, in Strong's, it's identified as H7300. And it is a primitive root, meaning to tramp about, to ramble about, free or disconsolate, to have dominion, to be lord, to mourn, or to rule. So we can see Nimrod as a phrase meaning we will be from dominion to dominion, or we will be from rulership, we will be from lordship. There is this, but the context of this prefix in a nun captures the idea of a plural, not a singular, but a plural word. We will be, not I will be. Like you might see if you had Amrud with an aleph beginning it. So at any rate, it appears to me to be very much a title, and so a title rather than a name. which means that other names are going to appear in the record, because there is very scant records talking about the name Nimrod other than in the scripture. There's records of other individuals, but not this person, Nimrod. So this is why I think the record, when we're talking about this record, this Akkadian record or the Sumer record, identifying other individuals of those names, that it's very possible that those names are not inconsistent or contradictory to scripture, because Nimrod is actually the name of a title rather than a proper noun. Mm-hmm. And this is very common, by the way, in scripture to see this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so with that being the case, and of course, we're only 4 generations from Noah, right? We have Noah, and then we have Ham, and then we have Cush, and then we have Nimrod. So the 4 generations, how is it that he is forming cities 4 generations later? How is it that there is this, what appears to be a vast population inside of 4 generations? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm just throwing that idea out there. So there's real questions about, number one, did the flood encompass all the earth? Number 2, were there other people that survived the flood? Now, there is some record that other people, there is mythologies in some cultures. There's even an Alaskan mythology that there were people that survived the flood. There's the mythology of, well, I'm not going to call it mythology. There's the historic discussion of the deluge. And there is also discussion about a woman in a boat surviving the flood. So, there's questions were there other survivors of this cataclysm? And so, such that, for instance, we see the same problem in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, that when Cain kills his brother, he's being cast from the garden. And when he's being cast from the garden, he says to Yah, anywhere I go, they're going to kill me. Who's they? Mm-hmm. If the only other people on earth are Adam and Hua, who's going to kill Cain? And in a similar situation, we have this question of how is it that we have a population that is so manifest inside of 4 generations? Now, I suppose it's possible if everybody had 12 kids. Of course, this is not the discussion that we get when we talk about the children of Put or the children of Canaan, etc., the children of Cush, which is only one name, Nimrod. So where are these 12 kids? Where are these, multiple generations that are expanding all over the place, such that the city of Babel can be formed? And he didn't just form one city, but 4 cities, mm-hmm. right? And so these are questions. Now, something else that we also see too, historically speaking, is that we get a different timeline in the Septuagint concerning the ages of the patriarchs. They all live 100 years longer in the Septuagint. And so the timeline seems to be much more expanded. Now, Gary, you were mentioning that the Sumerian record or the Sumer record tends to reflect the idea that this may have been 6 generations from Noah and not 4 generations. Isn't that what you said?
No, that's what it was understood as. No, I would suggest that Enmerakar, which is 3rd generation, with the same mythos of building a mountain and confusion of languages, just in a polytheist lens, because they're honoring not the god, they're honoring the gods of the Sumerian pantheon, Enki and Enlil, with the temples and things there. Gilgamesh is 6th generation, but yeah, I separate Gilgamesh and Nimrod as not being the same because of that disparity. And I would say the Sumerian tradition, despite of what Sayce and Smith did, was to conflate Nimrod with Idzubar, and thus Gilgamesh. Should have looked closer at the other records, like in the Lords of Arata and Enmerakar. It's Enmerakar and the Lord of Arata and Ninurta's Pride. If they would have looked closer at that, they would have probably had a better look at Enmerakar. I know David Rohl did, and did a pretty good job of did a very good job of making the connections to Nimrod as well from a biblical perspective. So I would also say that the name of Nimrod, and I'll let you back in here, Stephen. This Ninurta and Ninurta's pride is also the where Enmarkar is associated with, is the Sumerian god of hunting and war. So there might be some sort of passing on of that sort of title as well, in terms of that majestic sort of title onto Enmarkar, which has come through with Nimrod. So no, I wouldn't, if I was unclear on that, I want to make sure that people understand from what my research shows is that Gilgamesh is 3 generations later. Some people say 2. I look at it as 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there are some anomalies in the genealogy in Genesis. And we see this conflict with the genealogy given to us in Luke 3, for instance. And in Luke 3, talking about the genealogy from the Messiah through Joseph, the supposed father, and going all the way back to Adam, whereas Matthew 1 only goes back to Abraham. But yet the genealogy from Luke 3 goes from the Messiah all the way to Adam. There's an inclusion of another name in there, which is this name Canaan, the son of Shilach. And a lot of the commentators look at that and say, well, this is an interesting problem because this name Canaan does not appear in the genealogy in Genesis, nor does it appear in the genealogy given in First Chronicles. So who is this Canaan fellow that Luke is referencing? And was he referencing a different Tanakh? Was he referencing a Septuagint? What was his reference? Now, people say that the Septuagint does include the name Canaan. And of course, it's also found in the book of Jubilees in chapter 8, where Canaan is specified as being born in a particular year, the son of Shilach, who would find the writing of the Watchers. And in finding the writing of the Watchers, he translated it, which was discussing the omens of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And it says he sinned owing to it. And he disguised the fact that he had done it from Abraham so that he would not know, or not from Abraham, from Noah, so that he would not know that he had done these things. So when we talk about this idea of the genealogy, is it possible that there are generations short that were not included in the summario text of Genesis? Well, it's possible, but there's nothing confirming that. Because again, when you look in the Septuagint or you look in Jubilees, there's only one additional name. There's not a bunch of additional names in there between Cush and Nimrod. But we also have this difficulty of in Genesis 6:4, when we're talking about this idea of the Giborim, right? And so when the Giborim who come from time out of man, time out of mind, and the idea that it says that the last word in that passage is Shem. And so this word Shem, although it can be understood as like the idea of a name, but it is also a memorial of individuality, by implication and honor, authority. But it is the idea that this is coming from a mortal man. And so this is something that is really quite interesting, because when we talk about, the term Enosh, Shem is how it's spelled out in the Hebrew. When we see Enosh, and again, going back to talking about the Giborim, when we see the word Enosh, we see here that is the proper understanding of it is that it's dealing with a mortal man, So this passage in Genesis 6:4 is going to yield a very interesting equation, because we see, first of all, the first reference to the Nephilim, which sometimes is just understood as clouds, Nephil, but Nephilim being construed as the children of the Nephilim. And these are two distinguishing words. We see it very clearly in Numbers 13:33, where Nephal is without the yod. Nephil includes the additional yod. Nephal means the fallen. Nephil, the descendants of the fallen, which is, of course, described in Genesis 6:4 as giants. There were giants in the land in those days, the Nephilim. But who is it that transgresses but the Beni Elohim, the sons of Elohim, the Beni Elohim, come unto the daughters of men. And from them are born these mortal men. And what is this? Gibborim, tyrants, warriors, strong individuals. And so Nimrod is going to be one of these, is going to be this individual. But in the name Nimrod, we see in Genesis 10:8, talking about, and Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one on the earth. Now, again, going back into 10:8, in particular, this, the idea that we have this identification that says he began to be a mighty warrior on the earth, right? And by the way it's couched in the Hebrew is et Nimrod, Aleph Tav Maketh Nimrod, a particular kind of designation, right? V'kush Yelad et Nimrod, right? Hua Hachel Lechara Bena Baretz, on the earth. Okay, so we do have the idea that Nimrod is discussed in this passage as he, Hua, he began to be a mighty warrior on the earth. Now, this is distinguishable from the idea when you look at the title, we shall be king, we shall have dominion. Nimrod, we shall have dominion, being more or less, we're told this is his name, but the clear meaning there is we shall have dominion, and he began to be a mighty warrior on the earth. So I think there's enough delineation here to see that we are talking about a single individual, and we are talking about a single individual who is the direct descendant of Cush, which makes him fourth generation from Noah. So under those circumstances, then, when we look at this idea of him going out and building the tower, now, let me ask you this, Gary. The materials you see, are there any other possible locations for Babel other than in the Mesopotamian world?
We get accounts, and I was going to cover this off later, but we get accounts all around the world of the Babel story. And they're different, names for the mountains, but they're telling, the same sort of story. So we have Aztec accounts where giants helped build the tower. And again, you had the confusion of the languages and the gods. It's very similar to the Sumerian story. The Chula, related to the Aztecs, I'll say that the base was larger, twice the size in its dimensions as the Great Pyramid, and taller than the Great Pyramid that he was building. And you have the Armenian tradition as well. And you also have an Akkadian version, and you also have the Sumerian version, and there's other ones that make more vague references, not as detailed. Those are the most detailed accounts of the Tower of Babel. So somehow, some way, the story makes its way around the world, but that sort of makes sense if you look at people after, Babel is destroyed, are spreading out around the world with this story. So it's not surprising that it would come down, especially when it deals with the giant sort of aspect, as the polytheist versions tend to suggest that the king enslaved the giants to help build the tower. But again, that's their accounts. Now, what was interesting, and when I talk about third generation after the flood, Noah was born before the flood, so my reference to that would be,
generation after the flood, right? Yeah, I see that.
Okay, just so that people aren't confused with what we're talking, because we're not disputing the genealogy, just trying to make it sort of succinct in terms of the statement. So, what's also interesting, as you were talking earlier, was that who are the people that the people of the plain, which is chapter 28, which I'll drop into right now, they're coming down. They're being told right after the flood to multiply around the world. But yet they're going to come down the mountain as one people And then they elect in 11:2 not to be scattered over the face of the earth in direct violation of God's instructions after the flood to Noah to multiply and spread out around the world. And so why, if there was nobody else out there, why would they be afraid? Perhaps of animals, but they weren't even all that plentiful. They were still multiplying and spreading out around the world as well. So if you get this, and they're going to build a city and a tower. And a city, as it was built in the antediluvian times and how it begins very quickly after the flood, becomes a city of protection with high walls. So, and where does this knowledge come from? Which we'll get to a little bit sort of later again to build it, because you wouldn't think Noah would be passing on knowledge that helped sort of corrupt the antediluvian world, and they had to have a restart because of all of that. So, and then you get this odd translation in the Septuagint that Nimrod's a giant hunter, and that he made his reputation on, I guess, defending the Noahites from the giants. So, and it's this people where I'm sort of heading to is that the people of the plain, as I call them, as one group of humans, they are afraid, and they're going to elect to have an individual that's going to reign over them to protect them from these people. It's kind of like King Saul, who the people of Israel say, we want a king like the other kings who, would lead those armies into battles. And Saul was a full head, neck, and part of the shoulders taller than any other Israelite. And it was a great warrior, right? So again, it's kind of something that sort of comes downstream. And what's interesting as well in some of the research by Sayce and Smith in their translations is that they seem to think that there was two groups of people that became the Elamites that Nimrod's going to be intermarrying with. And Elam, and it's part of the old dynasties of Elam and the cities of Larsa and other cities. They're very important people early after the flood. And they're also part of the kingdom that's aligning with the third dynasty of centered in to march against the giants in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants. So to give some context here, right? And
very important.
Yeah. So what the secular historians, if they're actually secular, but the secular historians are saying is that the people of Shem intermarried with the Aboriginals that lived there. And they formed one people that actually formed two different peoples. Just let me finish here, Stephen. I'll let you in. And so it's like the Aboriginals in the covenant land that Canaan moves into, the giants. They're already there. So there's either a second incursion or a survival, but they're already producing in numbers. And now you know why the people are afraid. They thought they were going to be probably free of the giants. They knew what the giants were capable of doing before the flood. And this is all part of the psyche, and they're likely there to protect themselves. So the original people's name is thought, and I would agree with this speculation, is adopted by the Elamites of Shem, as we come to know them, from the people that they went to live amongst. And that's when you take Elam back to the Hebrew as equivalent word as Olamim, the ancient ones.
From time out of mind.
Yes. And so
time out of mind, yeah.
And so in the polytheist versions, you also have Nimrod intermarrying with giants after the flood into the dynasties to create these hybrid giant dynasties from the people that they're moving amongst after to live amongst after Babel. So things start to make some sense as to the story of, because they want to make a name for themselves. To who? God just saved them. They're God's people. They're blessed. and they want to make a name. Well, and with Nimrod, he's probably making a name as the leader in two different directions, right? One is to say, I'm rebelling and we are rebelling against you, God, and a name against the rivals because they've not made peace with them yet. He's getting a reputation from hunting these giants, and which is why he likely wins out. There's probably a dispute within as who's going to have the leadership. Josephus and the legend sort of covers that to a certain amount, but again, we don't get the biblical aspect, so we don't know how the power struggle went. But he comes to the top, probably because he's the best warrior and the best likely leader to go up against the giants. So I'll let you back in.
Fascinating. Yeah, when you talk about this idea of the Elamites, again, going back to Genesis 6:4, which is really kind of our leverage script here, the use of the word here when we're talking about, let's see if I can find it here just a minute. First of all, you have a couple of things. One is this: it's talking about the giants in the earth in those days, the Nephilim in the earth in those days, and it says what? There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Also after that. So that phrase is considered the akar, after that. And then what we see is that we're talking about that the Beni Elohiym came into the daughters of men and bore children unto them. The same became Gibberim, which were of old. Now, of course, the word there for old is olam. And this word for old, when I looked at this word, for old, it struck me that that olam was something more than just what you would use ma'olam vadolam, forever and ever, but rather a word. When we look at olam, it talks about that it means generally from time out of mind, So when we talk about the idea of the Elamites, the Elamites have a very similar spelling in the olam. So olam, aleph lamed mem, the elami, aleph lamed mem yod. So it appears to have the same source, namely this Hebrew 5867 contracted Elam. The Elamites, the Elamim, are those who spring from time out of mind. There are people that are from time out of mind. And so this is a very interesting idea. So when we're talking about the children of the daughters of men who have been invaded by the Beni Elohiym, they bear children unto them who become the Gibberim of old, from time out of mind, mortal men from time out of mind. This is the idea of Enoshim. So this whole idea of the Elamim, springing from the same word olam, time out of mind, is an interesting concept in terms of what we see that Genesis 6:4 appears to say outright that there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and they survived the flood because they were then after that. They were after that. And we get a similar discourse in Numbers 13:33, talking about the sons of Anak, who were Nephilim, who had come from the Nephilim. That is the children of the fallen ones, these Nephilim, but they are after the flood. The sons of Anak are the giants in the land when they get there. And they see these, to them, we're grasshoppers. And they see us the same way. We see them as these huge giants. And so this evidence that appears here in just the plain language of the text, the plain language of Genesis, is pretty clear, and the language of Numbers is pretty clear. It's telling us that there were survivors of that flood, that the Nephilim did in fact survive the flood. So this becomes a very interesting aspect. And then when you talk about the Elamites, or the Elami, this particular tribe has at its root, these are people who sprung from time out of mind. They were people from an ancient epoch. Now, when you went on to talk about this land of Ur is another very interesting equation, because we see Ur in its spelling has the same spelling as or, the word for light. Let there be light, and there was light. And we see also that Abraham had his source in the land of Ur, or this land of Or. And you might also remember that there are these two things called the Urim and the Purim, right? The Urim and the Purim. One of those indicating the lights lighting up the gemstones, the Urim. And so in all of that, there is a real question as to whether or not there was an area of Ur where there were survivors of the flood, the Elohiym. And how they did it, don't know. But, there's been some very interesting discussion about this Rikat structure in Mauritania. And the Rikat structure in Mauritania meets and qualifies to the same geographic description that is given by Plato and Diodorus concerning the city of Atlantis. And so when you see this idea of it, but I'll get into that in just a second. Somebody's looking for the precise definition from time out of mind. Yeah. Now, again, looking at I'm just going to go from the word olam, okay? And so in the word olam, it means, the way Strong's puts it, it says concealed, i.e. the vanishing point, generally time out of mind. So olam, when you're saying that they come from time out of mind, that means that they come from a prehistoric record. They come from a time where there is no history recorded. It's prehistoric. So in this case, when you're talking about time out of mind, you're not only talking about, and remember in Genesis 6:4, this is antediluvian. This is before the flood. So what are you talking about time out of mind? Well, you're talking about an epic that preceded the epic of Adam. And I think that's a very good way to put it, because when we talk about an epic that preceded the epic of Adam, there is indication that there was an epic that preceded Adam in the narrative of Genesis 1. The narrative in Genesis 1 has the creation of the earth, which I believe took, you can say it was in 6 days, but Peter says to Yah, a day is 1,000 years to us. And over this period of time, man is created. But it's not the same man that's created in Genesis 2. Because the man that is created in Genesis 1, it's written that, and Elohiym said, let us make man in our image and likeness. And he created them male and female, he created them. So even though they are called, generally speaking, man, Adam, but they are created as Nekeba and Zakar, male and female. Nekeba, female, Zakar, male. But Adam and Eve are not referred to as Zakar and Nekeba. They're referred to as Ish and Isha. And the Ish and Isha has a different kind of concept, because Ish and Isha are both another word for fire. Those are also words for fire. And so the breathing of life to the nostril of mankind, you see it. So you could say that the specificity in Genesis 2 is just a more specific detail of what took place in Genesis 1. But another translation on this, or another interpretation or understanding of the same language, is that there was a creation of a different kind of man that took place in the initial epic of 7,000 years. And then when you get into Genesis 2, where man is created on the second day, not the sixth day, and he's not created in male and female, he's created just male. And this idea, and then from the man who has X and Y DNA, the X DNA is taken out, not a rib. There's no rib in that language. Something else was taken out, a part. And I say to you, the part that was removed was the X DNA, because we see now that the X DNA is married with another X DNA to create the female. And a woman who has a double X DNA, man has Y and X DNA. The woman who has the double X DNA, those two are distinctly different. One X is different from the other X, but it does constitute the female as compared to X and Y constituting the man. So this whole idea that man is created first and the woman is taken from him is different from the narrative that is in Genesis 1. So, in fact, if there was a prior epic creation that lasted for 7,000 years, which may have come from a generation of an epic that preceded it, it's very possible that that happened. But you see that there would be a species of being who would spring from time out of mind. That is to say, the time out of mind is everything that preceded the creation of Adam. And remember that Adam was created differently. He was formed out of the dust, and Yahweh breathed the Neshama Chayim into his nostrils, and he became Nefesh Haya. Mm-hmm. So with this idea that there's two different narratives going on here, we can see that the discussion taking place in Genesis 6:4, saying the B'nai Elohiym are going to, why would, if you're talking about the B'nai Elohiym, the children of Elohiym, which is a very good description for who is created in Genesis 1. Elohiym said, let us make man, Adam, in our likeness and image. Okay, so this makes them the B'nai Elohiym. They're the children of Elohiym. So if the B'nai Elohiym are so different, what is the transaction that is described in Genesis 6 if they're not different? If that's just Adam and Eve, then what's the transaction that is described in Genesis 6:4 that is going to create Gibborim? Mm-hmm. They're going to be Gibborim, mortal men who spring from time out of mind, whose DNA springs from time out of mind. Mm-hmm. Olam, that's the word that's used there. So this is why when you talk about these Elamites, and so here we see evidence that we have evidence now, and we have evidence in multiple records that there were survivors of the deluge. There were survivors of the deluge, and these survivors were immediately in populations. And this is why it's always occurred to me. If you talk about Nimrod, and as Gary says, 3 generations from the flood, 4 if you count Noah, whose generation began before the flood, but you're talking 3 generations post-flood. So what are you talking about? 100 years? And he goes out and begins to conquer. Who's he conquering? His cousins? Is he out there? Hey, cousin Joe, you were at the family reunion last week. Now I'm here as king. I mean, is that what's going on? I don't think so. I think there's a lot more going on, that we're seeing this idea of indigenous peoples who sprung from time out of mind, maybe from the land of Ur, and in these indigenous people, and you might call them Aboriginal, but they may not have been Aboriginal. They may have been a sophisticated, educated, population who carried with them a lot of that knowledge and information that was held in the antediluvian world.
Yep. Well, Gary, we touched on this a couple of sessions back, and Stephen just hit it right here. It's actually in Genesis 7:22. So it says, and this substantiates that they were already here. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Yep. So those beings didn't have the breath of the nostrils, the Neshahamim breathed into them. So they were still here. So they didn't die. They survived.
Yeah. And also, when we look at, because we're not told specifically, I wish we had that smoking gun verse as the how giants show up after the flood. And and most people know I lean fairly heavily to second incursion, but I don't rule out survival. And it's not a wishy-washy position, because there is an avenue when you dig deep in, and like what you can certainly look at the Olamim and some other tribes like the Amalekim as being ancient, which is usually from before the flood, right? So you have these anomalies that you could maybe slice either way. But when I look at what the language is in Genesis 6 and 7, it says God is going to destroy everything he created. Well, he didn't create the giants. So you have a legal argument to suggest there's some survival. And so I leave a crack open for that. Genesis 6:4 also says that they were going to do it again, as in like manner. We don't know how many times again happens, probably multiple before the flood in like manner, but a door is open for again after the flood in like manner. So to recreate them in the same way. So you may have had 2 different kinds of giants showing up after the flood, one larger than the other, as Gilgamesh is larger from the east at 19 feet tall than Og, the greatest you can use based on his bed, of 9 cubits and 4 cubits wide would be, and as a royal cubit, because he's king of Edrei and Ashtaroth, and likely his original city was the Ugarit. He would be somewhere between 14 or 15 feet tall, because 9 cubits on a royal cubit would be about 16 feet long, just a couple inches shy probably. So you have a disparity in size and a disparity in looks, because the ones in Sumeria are dark-haired giants, and the ones in the Covenant land, except for the ones that are interacting and some of the migration of the Middle East, are red-haired, blonde-haired giants, as they're shown on reliefs and recorded in histories, and you get into the meanings of the names. So I leave a crack open that some survived, and there's also tribes like that are talked about amongst the Rephaim in Genesis 15, which are enigmatic, like what I call the triple K. We would know them as the Kenites, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites. I would say they should be better named as the Kenim, the Cadmonim, and the Kenizim. And the Kenites and the Kenites are very, Kenizzites and Kenites are very closely related in terms of association skills, but they're also mentioned in the Ugaritic texts as the sons of the East, as you take those, you have BNQDM,
Mm-hmm.
Ben Cadmonim, as you would sort of extend that through. And so, and Ben KN, and Kenim, as you put the plural on there again. So we have these people of the East that, and as you look at all of those names and the meanings, you're having a combination of the East and of ancient times. And they seem to be part of that mix. They may actually be the complete mix of the Elohiym, also in the East there, as they're located. So it's interesting that we have that, but we also have in the Ugaritic text a second incursion with the creation of the Rephaim and the tribes of the Detanu, the assembly of the giants after the flood. And just as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Utnapishtim surviving the flood, and all of his family are giants. But you also have Gilgamesh, 6th generation after the flood, and also Enkidu, created as well by Nin, fertility goddess, after the flood through King Lugalbanda for Uruk. And won't go into too much more minutiae on this, but just you have these examples of both. And you have also Deucalion, who is the Greek Noah, as he's understood in Pyrrha. He's son of Prometheus, so he's actually a giant. And in Hesiod, you have the accounting of the giants that are killed in the giant wars before the flood, and then there's a second creation of giants. So we have this sort of, wherever you go, you get kind of a survival possibility and a recreation, and something distinct between the Rephaim biblically and the Nephilim, because they're labeled differently. Just as you take the Anakim into Deuteronomy 2, it goes back to their giants as in Rapha and Rephaim. So still offspring of the Ben Ha'alim, but something distinct. So I think we have to be kind of open to the fact that these aboriginals, or the first ones that show up there after the flood, we have a survival possibility. And one would also deduce that some of the people of the plain are going to provide some daughters, in this case biblically, as it would relate to the Baalim, daughters of available to recreate the giants, as Anat would have done, or Amaru created giants, or Baal created giants. And one of the titles and names for Baal is very much similar to Raphael, spelled a little bit differently, but the gods had multiple names and multiple titles. He's also known as Hadad and Edad and other names I won't go into around the Middle East. So when we look at these giants that are created after the flood by the Baalim Council, it starts to add up biblically why there's specific delineations between some of the giants and some of their descriptions and some of their placings for us to understand. So I think Raphael might even come from RPM, which is right from the title. It's kind of an eponymous name for the first patriarch, Rapha, which is also one of the understandings you can have in the applications. But typically Rapha has a slightly different spelling for the names versus the giant or the demon spirit or the dead or the healer, but all related. So, and we also have a house of Beth Rapha, which is another interesting sort of tidbit that shows up into the Old Testament. So yeah, I think we need to understand that it's likely, and I would say if you're going to have daughters that are going to be supplied to the giants after the flood, as you connect that into the Baalim Council of the Bible, I think Canaan's the likely supplier of that. And then they're going to move not to Africa, where their land has been allotted out, that all the other Hamites go. He goes out of rebellion to lift that curse that was put on him, and he's going to continue to intermarry and live amongst the giants to not become a slave nation, or at least endeavor not to have that happen. So seems likely that there's a lot more going on, as Stephen says, and that there's a lot more giants or other peoples that are around after the flood than what we're led to believe, because otherwise things don't make a whole lot of sense in the details, like why build this city, and where did the technology come from, and so it's important to look at the narrative in all of its details, and it's important to ask good questions. Because if you don't, you get sort of brainwashed, I think, with the standard doctrine where they don't want to sort of deal with some of the questions that they may not, know how to answer. And what's interesting as we look at the Josephus account as this tower and city that Nimrod builds, he's going to walk up on this tower, and you see this in the book of Yasher and in Josephus, not necessarily in the Bible, but I think there's an inference there of this narcissism of Nimrod, and he is going to make threats to God that if he gets out of line again or bring another flood or try to bring another flood, he's going to go into heaven and kill God. And so how do you build mud bricks into something that's going to reach out of the firmament and into another dimension to be able to do that? Now people will say, well, that's just to rev up the people, but you'd have to be a madman to say that, because the standard dogma would suggest there wasn't that technology that was in place to do it. And this was a ziggurat, as you would build in the Mesopotamian region. And so ziggurat 2 would be a sacred tower or mountaintop, which is really interesting what they're trying to build. So now you have more of an imagery of a pyramid, whether it's pyramid or tower, doesn't really matter, or ziggurat. They were all used for the same purposes. But the interesting image is that this was a tower or a mountain rising into the sky, just as mountains do. And what's also interesting is Babel, as understood in the Akkadian story, and understanding Babalu, ILU would be the transliteration of El for an angel or a god, and Bab is a gateway or a tower. So now we're saying, okay, we don't know where the knowledge of the architecture or the masonry came from to build this great city that would protect against giants. They'd have to be very high walls. It would take very skilled masonry to be able to do that, and to build the rest of the city, and to build this tower that somehow Nimrod is saying he would be able to get into heaven in another dimension by using that ziggurat. We don't have answers within the stingy language of the Bible, but we are told, we get a hint at it, where it said that with one language and one people, nothing they planned would be impossible for them, or whatever they decided they would do, they could do. That implies significant knowledge, but again, we're not told where that comes from. And so all of a sudden, we have a story that has more questions to it than answers that are provided. And I say that kind of literally, because there's more questions, as you go, as you start to dig in, because none of the answers are going to sort of really explain it from standard dogma in terms of how we're taught. Because again, nobody else is supposed to be there. Why are they afraid? And why did they elect Nimrod? And what are they actually doing? And when you rebel from God, just as Nimrod broke his covenant, Kal-El, broke his bond, broke his covenant, using rituals, as you get the further understanding, and one would expect sexual rituals, you're getting this sense of polytheism that's involved here. Because if you're going to rebel against God, but you're going to create all of this stuff that honors, that was done by the giants and the Antediluvians and polytheists afterwards to honor their pantheon of gods, this is suggesting a Babel religion, which is the root word for Babylon, as we would understand that as the mother of religions, that would go back to an Antichrist type figure with Nimrod shortly after the flood, who is in control of all of the Noahites. So again, I know I've gone on for a fair bit of period, but it's time to say, okay, now we have another piece of the puzzle and what's going on here. So I thought I'd let you in there before I move on to what other evidence we have as to what's going on there. Not necessarily from the Bible, but it answers a lot of questions.
Sure. One of the things that I find interesting too is when we talk about this word that's commonly used for east, and the word that's commonly translated as east is the word kidma, right? Yeah. Kidma, which comes from this word kedem. And so what we see is, kidma, it's defined as, it means the forward part or the east, or in front of, right? In front of or the east. And so quite often this is in relationship to the sun and the sunrise and so forth. But when we look at the idea of kedem is saying, okay, the front of a place, the forepart, relatively from the east or from time, the front part of time, that is to say, in front of antiquity, often used adverbially to say anciently or eastward, but from aforetime, from the ancient time, which is then inferred as being from the east. Now, so when you talk about the Beni Kedim, the Beni Kedim or the Beni Kedimah, you're talking about people, you could say these are people from the east, maybe. But it could also be people from the ancient place, people from the ancient places. And when you're talking about the ancient places and you're using this in reference to the immediate post-flood world, then there is an inference in that language that these people came from ancient places. The migration, the reference was not from the east, but from the ancient places. Now, one of the things that is kind of interesting, and I want to kind of make this point, is that there's a huge megalithic world out there, prehistoric megalithic world. And it's really quite vast, and it's being more and more unearthed year by year of all kinds of megaliths that are time-stamped with cosmological dating stamps, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, for instance, that has a cosmological dating in its stones. The megaliths that are found in Malta, which appeared to line up with Sirius, that their portal was aligned up to spot Sirius coming through its front door. There's 5 of them, and they're all in a different position, which tells you that Sirius was moving, at least as it was observed from Malta, and that they had to keep building new temples every so often in order to keep seeing Sirius. So because that is the case, it's quite easy now with modern technology to go back and say, when was that temple able to see Sirius through its portal? And then you can date the temple. And by doing so, now we've discovered that we've got these time dates that are antediluvian, substantially antediluvian. And we also find the megaliths that are present off the coast of Japan, which appear to have steps that would accommodate people who were above 36 feet tall, steps in Peru that would accommodate people that were 36 feet tall, a footprint found in the granite in South Africa by Michael Tellinger that's 6 feet tall, that infers a giant of 36 feet in stature. There is a substantial record. We also find cities in the record, for instance, that are still underwater. There's a massive city underwater off the northern coast of Africa, near Alexandria, an Egyptian city. There's a massive city on the water off the Bahamas, a massive city off the coast of Japan, all underwater. We know that the North Sea was at one time Doggerland, an agricultural center that connected the British Isles directly to the continent of Europe. That's why you didn't see the tribe of Dan sailing into Belgium and the Netherlands, for instance, because there was no water there. They had to circle the periphery around the fjords of Norway, which was a deep waterway, down to Dan's Mark. So because of this, we can tell that there is a huge record that precedes the antediluvian record. That is a record of sophisticated building, sophisticated and difficult structures, really in many cases too impossible for us to build today. When you're talking about, for instance, these perfectly cut stones that are on the wall at Machu Picchu in a random sequence to which you cannot fit a human hair between the stones anywhere in any of the stones, and it is not a symmetrical lining of those stones the way they're built. This is a technology that cannot be replicated today. There are stones that are precision cut to exactitude that we cannot replicate today. The stones are too huge. They've talked to some of these guys that work the major marble factories in the marble mines in Italy that are cutting massive stones. They take a look at these stones and say, not possible, we can't do it today. And then, of course, you have this very fascinating megalithic record in India and Sri Lanka, where you find these elaborate buildings of such intense and detailed artistry that is replicated with magnificent symmetry, floor after floor after floor after floor. And the detail is incredible, as though it was laser cut and not chiseled by hand. Now, maybe it was chiseled by hand, but you have, again, a major megalithic record which does not comport with our understanding of civilization. So when you see this idea of Kedem, when you see that word, when you see the word east appearing in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, when you see that word, it's worthy of a review to say, is that from the east or from the ancient place? From the ancient place or the ancient places. And so this gives us a different inference. And so we're talking about Elohimites, that is to say, people who spring from time out of mind, who come from the ancient places. Again, what are these ancient places? And did they survive the flood? And what was the technology and the understanding of those ancient places? So again, going back to, and I'm one who does not believe that Scripture is ignorant as to these facts. It's there, but you have to read the Scripture to see it, and you have to read it in the original language to really catch what's being said. And so, for instance, when you read the passage in the book of Revelation, I am the Aleph Tav, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, who was, who is, and who is to come. Is that a passage that describes the epoch that was before man, the epoch that is man, and the epoch that is to come after this era of the age of man? Is that a descriptive of that? And the whole idea that we have this 7,000-year pattern, is there a 7,000-year pattern of destruction that comes to the earth? We talked about this before, Gary, in looking at Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that the earth became desolate and a void. The earth became desolate and void. And then you see the language that is instructed to man to replenish the earth in Genesis 1. Replenish, to refill it. Was it filled before? Was there a younger Dryas? Was there a cataclysm that ended this epoch that was followed by another epoch that which ended in a cataclysm, which then opened up into a second epoch that where it says, and the language, we got to be careful about this because it says, and Yah repented of having created man. Well, he really didn't repent he didn't say, gee, I'm sorry I did that. What he did was he grieved about having created man. And so man was a grievous disappointment to Yah. And in particular, because of, and I think there's a whole bunch of things that went into this, but because men were so easily beguiled, because of course, the perfect free nature of man is one where you cannot have perfect love without a perfect choice. And in order to have a perfect choice, man had to have the ability to say no, just as well as man had the ability to say yes. And so that perfect choice, which would create perfect love, created a very grievous situation because the early men, according to the scripture, had wickedness on their mind all the time. They were wicked and had wickedness only. They never considered Yah. All they considered was their narcissistic selves. And so as a consequence, we see after the flood, Yah is going to choose a people, and to them he's going to deliver a specific instruction. This is my covenant, do these and live in them. And so because of this, we see that the era of mankind now is expanded out to 6,000 years so far. But again, I think there is inference in the record. Genesis 1 gives us this inference of an epoch of 7,000 years that preceded the birth of man. Man is now in a different epoch. And in the epoch that man is going right now, Peter is the one who says in the last culmination, man was destroyed by water. But in the next culmination, man will be destroyed by fire. And so again, we have these predictions that are kind of on the table, giving us an idea that there is a culmination of events that flow on the earth. And so because of this, I just wanted to make that reference when we're talking about the idea of, is there more than one witness to the concept that there may have been survivors of the flood? Well, part of it is in this word kedem, that the ancient places may have survived. And part of it is in the elami or the olami, those who come from time out of mind. These are Hebrew words that give impetus to this idea that this was the case. Now, when we read in the English, or we read in whatever our common language is, we're looking at that language saying, where's the proof? Where's the second witness? Where's the hard evidence that shows these facts? When the Hebrew word is pretty explicit, it's given to you, the information is there. And the question is whether or not you're willing to accept that information on its face.
I'm a real fan of, looking at the ancient Hebrew and the Greek to get the fuller understanding, the fuller context. And again, using discipline, because I'll just throw out a wording and I know it's probably not in amongst your people, but other people that may watch this podcast, is that you just can't pick the meaning you want because it fits your preconceived conclusion. It can't create other conflicts downstream, right? It's got to fit the text, it's got to fit the narrative, and it can't contradict throughout the Bible. So, but when we're talking about adding the rest of the information to the definition, as the ancient Jewish and Israelites would have understood, just because they're brought up in it, they would understand the full context. Then it's unfortunate that isn't sort of translated through into English, right? But I know it would make the Bible a lot larger, but it's important to understand that I agree with what Stephen's saying, is that it will give you more depth if you do end up taking the time to take it back to the original language and then compare it to what the English one is, and you'll be amazed, I think. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at this architecture that is being talked about, and we have talked about this in other shows, but it's important. This is a restart. We have technology and knowledge being applied that is not accounted for, which is why the story gets dumbed down, so to speak. And yet we have these other witnesses of just within the building aspect that Stephen was talking about that has technology we cannot do today, no matter what anybody says, unless it's technology they haven't shown us yet because they've developed angelic technology, which I recognize is possibly the case. But we cannot build Machu Picchu today. We cannot. We cannot build the Great Pyramid today. Plus, we cannot put all of the sacred geometry to honor their gods in those buildings. And at the same time, put in all of these celestial alignments and earth ratios into it to honor the gods who they believe ruled the earth. It's just, and again, nobody wants to talk about that in a way that would say, well, geez, why does the pyramid structures over in Egypt sort of match up to Orion? And how did they do that? I mean, you don't have to go very deep to understand that what the Antediluvians knew, we don't know all of it yet because it's going to be like the days of Noah, and we're still catching up to that sort of technology. But yet, some of it survives after the flood and is starting to be used as witness at places like at Babel, with possibly, is this a technology that is also going in there? And as what we're finding is what I'm gonna link into a little bit now. What really was going on with the pyramids? What was its real purpose? We've had these discoveries underneath that has gone silent as to what's in these chambers that are underneath. But there's an interesting story by the secret societies who are, begat by the royals, the descendants of the giants, and in their ancient history and their histories of Freemasonry and the oral tradition, the Polychronicon, that their societies, as we've talked about in other shows, started before the flood, but it also crosses the flood. But they have a little bit more detail from their perspective of how that happens. So with the coming of the flood and linking into what is spoken of in Luke in the days of Noah, Luke introduces the destruction by fire that is attached to the days of Noah, which is the destruction by water, not shown in Mark and Luke, but the destruction of Sodom after the flood by fire, just as 2 Peter, as Stephen was referencing, is talking about this destruction by fire reserved for the end time, separate and akin to what was going on in the beginning. And the water, that the planet that was in the water and out of the water was, it perished, it died, which isn't the flood, because only what was on the earth died, not what was in the sea, according to the details in the Bible. But there's this destruction by fire that's going on. And so this understanding seems to be shown that the antediluvians did not know what kind of destruction was coming. Was it fire or was it water? So in their accounts, the secret society's account and Gnosticism and polytheism, they have two pillars that are created. One is to survive a flood. The other one is to survive a destruction by fire. And you wouldn't do both if you knew which destruction was coming. Mm-hmm. And on these pillars, and it's in two different accounts, and you can just, it's a polytheist account, but it's the pillars of Lamech and the pillars of Enoch. Lamech and Enoch, not of the Sethian lineage. Again, I go back to why I spent some time on the lineages in section 1, but of the descendants of Cain. Enoch is the second son of Cain. He's the sponsor of creating the 7 sacred sciences that's going to merge with the angelic technology, as is talked about in the book of Enoch and all polytheist cultures around the world. This is that angelic technology that the Gnostics and secret societies believed was the knowledge that was disciplined by Enoch into the 7 liberal sciences as we would understand it today, but they accredit that knowledge for building the pyramids before the flood. But again, we should not be surprised at that, because in the stela of Menes and Narma, you have the 52.5-degree slope pyramid in the background. And according to secular dating, they have got the flood 2950 to 3050. So that's before 23 to 2350 with Khephren and Khufu, who probably did more of a renovation than building of the pyramids. But that's who they would have you believe actually built the pyramids. So this knowledge was used to build the pyramids according to their belief, and it was of such spectacular nature to that civilization, these pyramids, is that they decided they would bury their knowledge in, now this is, understand it's a polytheist religion, so it's going to be interpretive because you need to be adept to understand. But I think it's just sort of in housing it in their belief system. 36,525 books. That is a solar understanding, as in 365 and a quarter days for a solar year, just as Enoch created sun worship, as we talked about, and the bull cult for this religion that's going to cross the flood. And in 9 vaults on top of each other underneath the Great Pyramid. Now, we also talked about a fellow named Hermes, Hermes in the Trismegistus, where there was either 2 before the flood, 1 after, or 1 before the flood and 2 after. They have 2 versions of it. This one would lean towards 2 after the flood, because Harmine, as he's called in their records, finds the pillar, the one that floats. And it has directions to where all his knowledge is hidden. And he goes there and he takes it back to, guess who? Nimrod. Mm-hmm. Now, this knowledge not only has the technology, but the religion. And also, Nimrod is seeing, if you buy into what we were talking about earlier, that the giants were there practicing their religion, which we would understand as, from a secular perspective, as a Zoroastrianism that crosses the flood. That was the original religion of the Persians of the Middle East and of the Indus Valley, and that this is the original religion of the giants, both before and after the flood. And also understand that Zoroaster before the flood is a giant. And then he has 2 other characters as well. And he was taught all the knowledge by Mithra, which is a significant god in the belief system, and where Lord Maitreya comes from for the Antichrist type aspect. So he's equivalent to like a Shiva, a destroyer god that comes at the end of an age to destroy and then restart it. And so he will come again, as Shiva does, to destroy the earth by fire in the end time. Just so you see sort of the connections in terms of the polytheist understanding and some of the allegories that we're going to start to see more of. So this knowledge is found by Hermes of the religion and all the knowledge that's there. And now they have the knowledge to build Babel City, Babel Tower. And this is the religion that they're going to worship, so that they can show that they're part of the same culture as the giants, and the basis for the Babylon religion of old for the end time, because nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again, and the understanding of this only brings grief and sorrow. So the cycles that Stephen is talking about is a restart here, and God's going to intercede, because you have an Antichrist type figure in control with a Babylon end time type religion in control. And he's associating with the giants, and according to the polytheists, will intermarry with the giants to create hybrid giants and dynasties after Babel. Mm-hmm. So this knowledge is taken back to Hermes, or not Hermes, to Nimrod, and he initiates in their accounts 1,000 masons to build the city. And masonry is the 5th science in the craft, and they introduced the craft, and the craft is the religion. So this is how we get to the additional sort of information. And if it's angelic technology, then that's interdimensional technology, just as in all polytheist religions, they had the ability to go back and forth between dimensions to where their gods live, in Hades or Sheol. It's recorded in the Ugaritic text. It's all through Mesopotamian history. It's in the Greek history. It's in the Egyptian history. It's a standard sort of doctrine, just as Baal would go back and forth between his empire in the earth, in another dimension, in Hades or Sheol, and come back every day also to the earth, where his council of the gods was located at Mount Hermon. And of course, that was quite convenient because that's where the gateway to Hades is located, at the foot of Mount Hermon, a portal, right? So we start to see some things sort of coming together in terms of this technology. And a mountain is a representation of what a pyramid is. And what's important about that is that the Harem Anathema oath was taken by the angels, likely before the flood and maybe again after the flood, at Mount Hermon, at Mount Saphon, at Mount Nippur, at Mount Sirion, at Mount Sion, at Mount Shinar, all the different names for Mount Hermon, to establish their oath-based society, where they would anoint the giants at the assembly of the Detanu, the assembly of the ring lords in the Sumerian tradition, at Mount Olympus. They would give their authority to the kings to rule with their divine right, because they're the offspring of the gods, right? So when we look at this technology, all of a sudden now, we might look at Babel as not only honoring the gods in all sorts of different ways, but also as an ability to go interdimensional. As Babel is understood in Babalu, a gateway of the gods, that's a portal, interdimensional travel. And so he may have been building, and may have succeeded, if permitted to continue, to be able to go into heaven and make war in heaven. If God got out of line again, according to the rationale. And this is reserved for Antichrist, and only him, who in Daniel 7 and 8, and particularly in 8, where he is going to throw down some of the starry host and raise his throne up to heaven. This is what he does at the midpoint of the last 7 years, which would equate with that Revelation 12 passage of the war in heaven, that he would be accompanying. Of course, that's when Antichrist comes to power, at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And you have this ability to also say, well, if he is now converted to the religion of the giants and the gods that they worshiped, and that if the antediluvian giants were put into the pit prison, antediluvian gods were put into the pit prison for those crimes, and if there was a second incursion, like with Baalim and the Baalim Council creating likely Rephaim giants in this case, and others, if they're created elsewhere, they disappeared as well in those records. They were killed as well. Well, gods and angels aren't killed, whether it's El as the parent god before the flood for Baal, or Baal after as the offspring god. You can't kill them, but they disappear. But because that's why? Because they went to the pit prison for the same crimes after the flood as before the flood, if there was a second incursion. And one of the reasons why I lean that is part of the giant legacy. But he would have been able to, Nimrod would have been able to, with this technology, to do what the giants were able to do, who had the technology to go back and forth between the dimensions. And this is carried forward right through to the Ugaritic text after the flood, after Babel, that they can go interdimensionally. And that he would have been able to go down and perhaps free those in the pit prison, would have been the goal, to get his gods out that they're worshiping. And so the Gnostics make a very good case on this as to where this knowledge comes from, and it answers a lot of questions.
Absolutely. Well, Wyatt said it earlier about the skins of clothes that are from Adam that Nimrod inherited. So maybe those
Yeah,
had some kind of significant power, just like the
from
rod
Adam
and
and
the
Eve.
staff.
Yeah,
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 yeah. Just
yeah,
like the rod and the staff of Noah and Aaron had power. You know, those skins of clothes obviously had power, and that's why they use those pyramids for power sources. As you know, with the ley lines, they don't need the power sources that they sell us. You know, that's
yeah,
just something to keep us quiet and pacified. That's why they don't care when they hit the MP to turn it all off, because
yeah,
they still have that power they can harness right out of the air through the technology of the ley lines. So they know what they're doing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I'll let Stephen in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and speaking about that, again, when we talk about the translation there in Genesis 6:4,
Mhm.
the discussion is the transgressors in that passage are the B'nai Elohiym. The B'nai Elohiym come unto the daughters of men. And this appears to be a distinguishment between those created in Genesis 1 and those created in Genesis 2, because it's a transgression that takes place and something unusual is created. Gibborim are created, mortal men from time out of mind. Now, when we look at Job 1:6 or Job 2:1, we find the following passage. Now, there was a day when the B'nai Elohim came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Hasatan came also among them. And Yahweh said unto Hasatan, from when do you come? And then Hasatan answered Yahweh and said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. Now, this passage, in my opinion, discusses the fact that the B'nai Elohim had the capability of appearing in the presence of Yahweh. So these two passages infer that, in fact, they did have this ability. And so you find a difference in the scenario between the B'nai Elohim in Genesis 1 and the fall of Adam and Hua that takes place after Genesis 2. Because with the fall of Adam and Hua, sin comes into the world and death comes into the world. But it doesn't come into the B'nai Elohim in the same way. They have the ability to move back and forth into heaven. Now, one of the things you see, and again, I'm just talking about this in terms of what you can see readily in the scripture, is that we know that with Mashiach, that Mashiach is resurrected from the dead and then ascends in front of the site of the Talmudim. They watched him ascend. Now, this is probably a trans-dimensional ascension that takes place, but nonetheless, he ascends. And we also see the idea that he refers to himself throughout much of the gospel as the son of Adam, the Ben Adam, the son of man, the Ben Adam. The son of man has come to say, the son of man has done this, and the son of man has done that. But when he comes off the mountain of the transfiguration, again, Mount Hermon is where the transfiguration happened. They call it Caesarea Philippi in the Gospels, but that is describing what we today call Mount Hermon. And when he comes off this mountain, he is referred to as the Ben Elohim. He's no longer the Ben Adam. Well, he still is the Ben Adam, but he is also referred as the Ben Elohim. Now, it is written that Paul talks about this, and it's also talked about in the Gospels, that he gives unto us to become B'nai Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
He gives unto us, in the English, he gives unto us to become sons of God, but in the Hebrew, to become B'nai Elohim. So we see that there is a transition that's going to take place from the Ben Adam to the Ben Elohim, and this transition then allows what? This ability to appear in the presence of Yahweh as the B'nai Elohim, as they can in Job 1:6 and in Job 2:1. So this is a hard teaching, of course. It's a difficult teaching because we like to infer that the B'nai Elohim created in Genesis 1 were evil or wicked or somehow major transgressors, and yet in their creation in Genesis 1, after their creation, Elohim says, it was good. It was good. And so we have some very interesting ideas. We talk about this technology that would be built by Nimrod and this ziggurat that he would build. Is there something more in this ziggurat than we're building a tower that's going to allow us to reach above the stratosphere and poke at Yahoos hanging out at 45,000 feet? The big ziggurat today is, of course, the Burj Dubai, right, which is 1,776 feet tall and does quite often rise above the cloud cover. You fly into Dubai, you see this tower sticking up, and the clouds everywhere else, right? And because of the enormity and the size of the Burj Dubai. But again, when we look at this idea of what was being built, given the technology that we see evidenced in the antediluvian world, were they building something else that we don't understand? When you mentioned the pyramids, we know that the pyramids of Giza are fixed at due north to within 0.3 of 1 degree in perfection. And not only that, but the massive size of these pyramids, they're not 4-sided pyramids. They're 8-sided pyramids that have slight indentations on all 4 sides so that they can cast a shadow during the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox. Where you see 2 equally lined shadows, you have arrived at the equinox. The perfection in terms of their alignment, and I would submit to you that even that alignment is probably more perfect than when you think, because it's 0.3 of a degree in its alignment to Polaris. But they didn't use Polaris as the North Star at that time. They used a different star, and it's perfectly aligned with that, without error. So when you go and you look at those massive stones, and you see that collection built into that pyramid, and those stones are so subtle as to create a slight indentation in the walls, and yet create the perfection of the symmetry, all of it perfectly aimed at due north. Show me the crane system you're going to put in place that's going to do that today, right? I mean, it's just hard to even contemplate. And then, of course, there's the disparity between the big pyramid and the second pyramid. It's offset. It doesn't line up. It's offset a little bit. Well, that offsettingness, by the way, has a geometric meaning that also is of enormous importance, which infers a static ley line that runs from Edinburgh through London, by the way, which is where we fix 0 degrees Greenwich, England, right? And so there again, this is something that's predictive of that. When we see the predictiveness of Stonehenge actually predicts an algorithm. It's not there to do human sacrifice or to even see the vernal equinox. It predicts an algorithm. The algorithm is within 3 decimal points of predicting the exact algorithm of the elliptical mean of all 10 planets. They believe it has an origin of at least 1500 BC and maybe older than that, right? It's not in its original location, but it is in its original configuration. But it has an age that goes back, could be more than 1500 years BC. It could be much older than that. And so we see a number of things in the megalithic record that are giving inference to the fact that there was a very substantial technology. The technology infers that there was a knowledge of very high-end engineering, very high-end technomechanics, et cetera, that were being used, including probably anti-gravitational devices. There is some record that infers that nuclear weapons were used before, particularly on the Sinai, where they found trinitite, the green glass that results from a nuclear bomb going off. People like Irina Caesar and Michael Tellinger have argued that there was, in fact, a nuclear war, a prior nuclear war in a prior epoch, but it could have been quasi-nuclear destruction caused by something else. Like, for instance, it's one thing to say we have 2 choices. We can either be destroyed by fire, we can be destroyed by water. But the planet Rahab appears to have been destroyed by an asteroid or a comet or something that made a direct hit on that planet that turned it into an asteroid belt instead of a planet in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. So there's also the chance of that happening. In fact, Revelation predicts a major astronomical event with something like a meteor or a comet hitting the Earth. It's called wormwood, right? It's discussed in detail in Revelation. So there's a number of things here that we begin to see in looking at all of these predictives and so on. And we talk about the idea of Nimrod, again, probably a title and not a name. And we see what emerged in this area was this ziggurat that Nimrod was building, not necessarily a tall building, but a building of particular effect, a building that may have had anti-magnetic properties, a building that may have had trans-dimensional properties, a building that may have had all of these things that are beyond our understanding in terms of harnessing the electromagnetism of the earth, et cetera. These kinds of things being developed using a technology that had come forward from the ancient world. And when we deal with, when you deal with the book of Enoch, remember that in Enoch, even though there is a great description, and it's quite a specific description of the solar year, that solar year, by the way, is really quite phenomenal, because the modern astrology, talking about Capricorn and Aries and Taurus and these kinds of things, is exactly form fit to the description in Enoch, beginning with the winter solstice of December 21st and continuing back to that winter solstice. And when we talk about, and so that's really what I call the zodiac, not the zodiac, but rather the zodiac. And this zodiac calendar has been adopted very specifically by the Roman Church. So when you walk into the Dormition Church in Jerusalem, for instance, it has a massive round rotunda, and on that rotunda are the 12 signs of the zodiac. We went into the main church in Palermo, Sicily, and in the middle of the floor, just before you approach the altar, there is a line, a diagonal line that is drawn across the floor in the marble, and there is a hole, very microscopic hole, that appears in the roof that lights up that line, and where the light pinpoints on that line, they have all the signs of the zodiac along that line, so that it goes out and then recedes across the floor. And so you'll see one zodiac sign here and another zodiac sign on the other. But it does exactly what the Enoch calendar predicts. So it's quite fascinating to me that the zodiac calendar, beginning on December 21st with the winter solstice, would be so conformed to modern astrology, such that, all of you, if you look at the astrological signs, they all change on the 21st day of the month for the most part. And they do it in the pattern 30 days, 30 days, 31, 30, 30, 31. However, when you get to Enoch chapter 73, Enoch says point blank that the first day of the month is when, and the first day of the year is when the light comes into the new moon in the fourth solar month. And so really, both Jubilees and Enoch do predict a solar lunar calendar. Jubilees is very clear. It says, the first new moon, the fourth new moon, the seventh new moon, the 10th new moon, these are the beginning of your seasons. And so the new moons are very much a part of the solar lunar calendar in both Jubilees and in Hanok. And so when we talk about these seven sciences, you mentioned the seven sciences. There's a passage in Enoch, it's Enoch 93:12. And he says, he's talking about these generations and these various timelines. And these timelines are, of course, are amassed on Jubilee years and the weeks he's talking about, the weeks of Jubilees. And he talks in the seventh week, he says the sevenfold doctrine of Yah's creation is revealed unto the righteous. Now, the sevenfold doctrine of his creation, maybe you might construe it as seven sciences. And of course, there may be, secularists and polytheists who looked at this and then extrapolated the sevenfold doctrine as seven sciences. But we know that the sevenfold doctrine that's laid out by Enoch is pretty clear. I mean, there's 7 words in Genesis 1. There's a 7,000-year creation event in Genesis 1. There's 7 ruachot identified in Isaiah 11:2. There are 7 sins that are identified by Solomon. There are 7 feasts that are identified in Leviticus 23. And of course, we have this idea of forgiving somebody 7 times 70, right? Even arguably, when you look at Daniel 9:24, sevens are predicted for you or prophesied for you. And then in Daniel 9:24, we have 7 things laid forth. There are 7 prophecies that are put to an end with the coming of Mashiach. Wow. So the sevenfold doctrine of Enoch 93:12, I think, is expressed throughout Scripture. Now, they may have derived 7 sciences from this. There may have been, pagan or rural or polytheist or whatever, secularist or other religions that have adopted the 7 sciences from this. And can you, if you would, Gary, can you tell us what those 7 sciences are?
Hey, Gary, before you go, I just wanted to let you know we're coming to the end of the program again. So when you give us the 7 signs, you can wrap that up, and then
I'll wrap it up. Yep, I'll try and wrap everything up here.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah, when we talk about the 7 sacred sciences, those are the 7 liberal arts that we have today. So it's going to be things like mathematics. It's going to be geometry. It's going to be astronomy. It's going to be rhetoric. It's going to be dialectics. It's going to be grammar. So just look at the 7 liberal arts. And what polytheism does is they counterfeit everything. Knowledge is neither good nor evil.
Yep.
That's how it's applied, right? So, but they counterfeit everything in heaven and outside of heaven, on the earth, and they put it into their knowledge religion, which is polytheism. And so when we look at, I was just thinking about the portals, and you were mentioning Stonehenge, and there's a word called dolmen, which is like this 2 pillars like this of stone and then a capstone. And those are dolmens, that means portal. So those Stonehenge arrangement has a lot of alignments, a lot of things, but it's also theorized and said in polytheist realms that those were all portals for multiple crossings of thousands and thousands of spirits from the other side. So if we look at Gilgal-Raphaim at the base of Mount Hermon, you have that's the wheel of the giants or wheel of the spirits, depending on how you want to translate that. That's on the Golan Heights. That has like 100 dolmens in there. That's part of the original site. It's just part of their belief system, and that they had an ability to access that. So, and I'll just quickly go over this, and if people want to take the time to read the passages on it, it's quite a fascinating read. I would be starting at about Mark 16 and the building and the start of the church, or Matthew 16, I'm sorry, at Caesar Philippi, or at the base of Mount Hermon, that Jesus is establishing his church at the location where the Pan Temple is and the gateway to Hades. He's making a clear statement there that he's going to build his church, and the location where the Council of the Gods is located at, there's nothing that they're going to be able to do about it. It's a declaration. Now, in 1 Peter, when he is in the grave, in 1 Peter 3, he is visiting these spirits in the prison. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now he's talking to them. And I usually say, and my speculation is he's telling them that when I resurrect, which you have not anticipated, because they wouldn't have had him crucified according to the first book of Corinthians, if they knew about the resurrection, your rebellion is pretty much over. And how I get there is through Ephesians 4 and Colossians 2. And in Colossians 2, it talks about making a spectacle of these gods and these spirits who enslave us in the earth. And in Ephesians 4, you get more details of this parading out to make this spectacle of. And Paul is quoting Psalms 68. And that's where you get all the detail on it. And so when you look at what's the details they're saying, they're making a spectacle and hauling them to Mount Hermon and pronouncing sentence on them before returning them back to the pit prison to let the rest of the prophetic time period play out. But they've been basically sentenced to the lake of fire that happens in Matthew 25. So just a little bit of detail around some of these things that we get out of the New Testament. Now, to finish up on this is that chapter 30 is, I named the original Great White Brotherhood. And I had made connections talking about this knowledge from the Masons and the Gnostics in terms of their history on that. And that he initiated 1,000 Masons to build this project. And again, that's probably an allegorical number, but who cares? Mm-hmm. And that he creates the first Great White Brotherhood, the visible one, at Babel. And this is the same title that's going to come down to the Great White Brotherhood that's going to have a new constitution written in Heliopolis with the Egyptians. And then is going to be the term that's used by the Illuminati, other secret societies, as part of their allegorical imagery. And also, as the White Brotherhood is understood, is they're invisible ones. So there's two groups, invisible ones and the visible ones, both calling themselves the White Brotherhood. The Council of the Gods, the Council of the Giant Kings, and their visible hierarchy that includes the elementals that rule this world. Again, in that same passages in Colossians 2 for the elementals, and look for, no, that'll be rudiments there. In Galatians, it's called elementals, but it's both applications translated from Stoichian, which is not an inanimate thing to enslave us in the world. So there's two definitions there. So I'm just going to close this out on this visible hierarchy has their first constitution, according to the Masons, written by Nimrod at Babel. He is their first grand master after the flood, and a highly honored patriarch within that belief system, where he reintroduced Enochian mysticism, or Zoroastrianism as we would know it from the secular world of the religion of the giants, that has now created an end time scenario, and thus the intercession of God to permit all the names in the book of life to have their opportunity to leave their names left in or blotted out. And this book was created from before creation, because Jesus and God are Alpha and Omega. And so this is, as Stephen was talking about, it's just playing out, and it's playing out in cycles. And we've seen this cycle come down through Babel, through the beast empires with the daughters of Babylon, becomes fulfilled in the end time with the seventh empire, the Babel religion, and then Antichrist and his religion through the end times. So I'll leave it on that, but these 4 chapters have so much information and gives you a nexus point and a beginning point of the antediluvian world and the post-diluvian world, and it's connected because nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again.
Amen. Amen. Wow. Fantastic, Gary. What a way to close it out. And I want to add one more thing for Stephen with his sevens. With Fourth Estridge 775, it talks about the 7 ways that we are to see the wonders when we die. There's another 7 for you, Doc.
Yeah, beautiful.
And Gary, maybe next time you come on, or one time after that, since you brought up the Enochian mysticism, you can enlighten us and let us know about the Enochian keys that they were looking for in Iraq with the Gilgamesh and all that stuff going on, and what the Enochian keys do. So,
well, yeah, and what's also kind of interesting on that is that from Hillary Clinton's office, I have the FOIA request from them on a link I can send people to get a hold of me. Is her office, and I can't remember the name of the person who sent it, and you'll get the FOIA number and everything on it. Is they wanted more information on the remains and the technology of the revival chamber of Gilgamesh that was discovered in Iraq. So this is not conspiracy theory.
Right. Exactly. And what those Enochian keys do. So
yes,
that's great. We just wanted to thank everybody again for tuning in, all the people in the chat, all the information you put in the chat. And most of all, I want to thank Gary Wayne and Dr. Stephen Pidgeon again. Man, what an amazing show. The two working together in shalom. It's just beautiful for all of us to see. And now, of course, we're going to ask Stephen if you would take us out with that, Hebraic prayer that you always pray. Baruch atah Avinu. I love hearing that Hebraic prayer. The Hebraic prayer that you do and the way you do it is so fulfilling.
Baruch et Yahweh. Hamevarak leolam vayed. Baruch atah Yahweh Sevaot El Kadosh Akadia Shalel. Melech HaMelekim, Melech HaKavod. Elohai Yasharel, Elohai Avraham, Elohiy Yitzchak, Elohiy Yaakov, Avinu Ma'olam Vad Olam. Shema Tehilinu Yahweh. Hear our prayers as we lift them before you today. Yahweh, the King of Kings, the King of Glory, the Elohai of Yasharel, of Abraham, of Yitzchak, of Yaakov, our Elohai, our Elohiym, our Father forever and ever. Leke ata hagevra hagedula hagivra hamemleka hatifala hanetzech hod. Yours is the glory, the beauty, the victory, the majesty, and the kingdom. Ma'olam vadolam, forever and ever. In the name of Yahweh, in the name of Yahushua, we lift our prayers to you, Yah, and say, bless us today.
Yes.
Bless us and keep us. Shine your face upon us and place your name over us, that we might be called the B'nai Elohim, your children, that you might be our Father, and you would look upon us and realize that we are your kingdom. Hallelujah, Yahweh. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Amen. Amen.
Thank you. Amen. And thank you, everybody, once again. And there's no show next week because we're getting ready for Sukkot. Just to let everybody know, we'll be getting ready to travel and head to Sukkot. So bless everybody, and you're all dismissed. Have a wonderful day.
See you later.
Take care now. Oops.